Today's speakers are Agnes and Fanny. Agnes has been focusing on EU sustainable construction policies and regulations, circular economy, global environmental product declarations, and sustainable building assessment. Her passion is to get life cycle thinking in the construction sector integrated into daily practice and sustainable buildings mainstream as part of a circular economy. Fanny worked 6 years at the Danish Institute of Fire and Security Technology, where she managed the Strategic Resilience Department. Her work was focused on both international and national projects, researching fire safety engineering as well as resilience. What is Fire Safe Europe? Fire Safe Europe is a Brussels-based not-for-profit association set up in 2011 with the mission to improve fire safety in buildings for people. It promotes the highest standards for fire safety in buildings for regulations, policies, test methods, and best practices. It connects policymakers, firefighters, NGOs, and industries in view of keeping people safe from fire in every building they spend time in. We will now have a brief poll in the webinar just to get some feedback on if you've heard of fire resilience before today and your opinion about it. This is a summary of what we'll be discussing in the webinar today. We'll be going over 4 main points. And now I will hand off the webinar to Fanny.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. To start with, I would like to give a short introduction to resilience and sustainability and what we mean by that. Resilience, yes, as you see, the definition is on the screen right now. And but this is not anything new. The term resilience has been around for centuries. There are traces of the use of the term already in 1625, but it has been used firstly in engineering and ecology and psychology before coming to more civil protection in humanitarian domain. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction came with this definition that you see on the screen now in 2009. And we like this definition very much because it's more of a holistic approach. It includes system, communities, and society, and not only one domain. Then on the next slide, you see the definition of sustainable development. And this is a modern concept that has been derived mostly from the 1987 Brundtland Report, and it's also rooted in earlier ideas about sustainable forest management and 20th century environmental concerns. The concept, of course, has been developed with time, and it has shifted to more economic development, social development, and environmental protection for future generations. The concept of sustainable development has been and is still sometimes subject to criticism. What do we mean by sustainable development? It's been argued that there's no such thing as sustainable use of a non-renewable resource, because of course, if you exploit it, it will eventually lead to the exhaustion of that resource. It also has been argued that the concept has been used as a publicity slogan, but nevertheless, the UN adopted the concept via the Agenda 21 in 1992. And then from then in 2015, the United Nations adopted it formally with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, where the 17 SDGs that you see there have been also adopted. And that's what Agnes will also talk about a little bit later. And what does that mean? And why is it important? Why is resilience and sustainability so important? And I thought that pictures say it all. Here you can see the tsunami in Indonesia in 2004, which killed between 230 to 280,000 people. And then the next, a little shorter or smaller, would I say, disaster in Lac Mégantic, where actually close by where I'm from. In 2013, when this tank train exploded in the middle of downtown, killing 47 people, but also bringing a lot of damages to the city itself and the economy. So that is just to remind us ourselves why sustainability and resilience and disaster resilience is important. Moving on to explaining what is the link between fire resilience and sustainability, explaining a little bit more about fire resilience, what we mean by that, and sustainable building, and why we say that a building is not sustainable if it's not fire resilient. Fire resilience often has been seen as the ability to a building to withstand the effect of fire, or a material to withstand the effect of fire. So it's often a synonym of what we know as fire resistance. However, we see fire resilience as much more than the ability of a building or material to withstand this effect. Fire has an effect on the environment, the economy, and the community, as I already said. So again, here we have a holistic approach where we're looking at just more than one event. We're looking at different sides of things, and that's why we need to look at that. And sustainable buildings, showing the definition here from Tidwell and Murphy. The practice of creating sustainable high-performance structures that is a holistic approach to design, construction, and demolition, so as to minimize the building's impact on the environment, the occupants, and the community. You see clearly here the link between that definition and the one I just gave before, being a holistic approach, having the environment and the community and the occupants involved. So that's why we see that it's quite simple to see the link. For buildings to be sustainable, they also must be fire resilient. We have experienced a little bit of a disconnect between the discussion around sustainability, who are basically taking into account that fire has been and all in building codes and regulations. And on the other side, when we look at building codes and regulation, they deal with fire safety, looking at escapes like sprinklers and emergency exits, but they're not looking really at fire resilience. If you're thinking about, for example, training the community for being more fire resilient or community resilience, it's not in the building codes or regulations. So there's a disconnect here between, it falls between two chairs with fire resilience here. And I would like to give some examples of why the environment and the economy and the community have a significant impact on fire resilience, or why fire has an impact on them. If we're looking at the environment, the efforts to improve the sustainability of buildings is often focusing on increasing energy efficiency and reducing the embodied carbon, though the fire could reduce the overall sustainability of a building through releasing of pollutant and the subsequent rebuild. Fires have a range of less immediate and obvious adverse consequences on the natural environment, such as air contamination, like land and water as well, contamination from water runoff containing toxic product, and other environmental releases from burned material. So there we clearly see that fire has an impact on the environment. If we're looking at the economy, and how the economic impact of fire is defined is all the sum of all indirect costs and direct losses due to fire incident, which is a subset of the total cost of fire. And the losses from large fires are expected to be high, and though so will impact the economy considerably, also in the regions. If we look at the example I have here in the US, and this is data from the National Fire Protection Association, the total cost of fire in the United States in 2014 was $328.5 billion, which represent 1.9% of the US GDP. And over the years, the costs have increased from 1980 to 2014 by 50.3%, which is quite considerate, though we have to say that the GDP impact has been less and has been going down from 7.6 to 1.9%. But that could be that the GDP had a great growth since then, or there's also some fire protection investment that also have an impact. But you can see that clearly that fire and economy are having an impact on each other. And then finally, the last example I wanted to give here is with the community. And I wanted to give another side of it, because there's, of course, the fact that fire has an impact on community. Is going to disturb the whole community if there's a fire, for example, in critical infrastructure. And the example I give here is the South Korean hospital in the beginning of this year, where 37 people were killed and 100% injured, but it was a small hospital in a small region. You need to put your patients somewhere when they were evacuated. They could not move themselves. The hospital was closed, so they would have to travel further to get the needs, what they need in the hospital. So that is an effect that fire can have on critical infrastructure. It can be a small or a big, but it will have an effect on the community. Though the community also can have a positive effect on fire resilience. If we're thinking about the example of Grenfell, where you can see how the community organized themselves after the event and how the community also warned the others during the event. So investment in training, having a fire ward in a building or a person in charge of all kinds of emergency, that can make a difference, and that could also increase not only community resilience, but fire resilience. And then now I'm going to pass on to my colleague Agnes, who will focus on sustainability gains of fire resilient buildings.
Yes, I'm unmuted now, so you could hear me. Thank you, Fanny. Maybe one slide up. One slide before, well, that was just a title, saying that you have heard now why buildings must be fire resilient to be sustainable. But let me tell you more about what it could mean to include this fire resilience in your sustainable building considerations. And many of you will know, as you see on this slide, that sustainable buildings really mean business today. Sustainable buildings have added value for the people living and working in the buildings, their productivity, but also the operating cost of buildings, the rentability and the building value when you hand over a building. And therefore, well, next slide, not sure if it works with me. Well, maybe Kat can, yeah, there it comes. Therefore, it becomes increasingly important to assess the sustainability performance of the buildings. And since many years, we have commercial building rating schemes in place for this purpose, like BREEAM and LEED globally, HQA and DGNB in Europe. And also recently, the European Commission published a better version of a method called Levels, providing core sustainable building indicators. And resilience belongs to these indicators, unfortunately so far restricted to resilience to climate change. Private schemes focus mainly on resilience to natural disasters, but it's obvious that fire resilience should be the next step to get more sustainable buildings and a more complete assessment of sustainable buildings. We are very fortunate that, come on, yeah. We are very fortunate that we have SENS standards in place to assess sustainable construction. They are guiding us here. And these standards are based on life cycle thinking, as the building assessment schemes are. These standards provide a full set of indicators, not only core indicators, but a full set of indicators and also methods for an environmental, social and economic assessment of our buildings. And these SENS standards do include a performance assessment towards what is called accidental actions. You can think of earthquakes, explosions, but also fires is explicitly mentioned in these standards. And of course, there's no designer who will ever design a building to burn down. Nobody plans his building to burn down, but we should realize that it does happen, even on a regular basis. It's simply a realistic scenario when you're developing your scenarios for the life cycle. It's a realistic scenario for each and every building that a fire can occur during the lifetime of a building. So resilience will help to ensure that this cycle we aim at with our sustainable and circular buildings will be maintained, and regardless of the disruption, including fire. And it's therefore that insurance business recognizes that resilience, or you can also read here, loss prevention, is indispensable for sustainable buildings. Fanny already mentioned it shortly. Think of the pollution. Think of that you have to rebuild a building, and research from FM Global shows that carbon emissions over the life cycle of buildings, which were intended to be sustainable, will dramatically increase when a fire takes place. The carbon emissions will even end up at a higher level than carbon emission of conventional buildings. So if you think that 1 out of X buildings will catch fire during its life cycle, during the lifetime you can really see that it's important for the sustainability performance to take care of fire resilience in this respect. And the first European legislation that makes this link is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the EPBD. More energy efficient buildings may imply new construction methods, new materials, and if not considered in an appropriate way, it could impact the fire safety of the building. So attention is required not to compromise this. And this is exactly what the EPBD envisages, not to compromise this fire safety. But such a step as made in the EPBD is not yet made in sustainable building rating schemes. There is a disconnect also, which we experience here. Fire resilience is not yet recognized as an indispensable aspect of the broader resilience approach. This disconnect, there's a gap to close between the perception of codes and regulations, as Fanny explained, and our daily reality. Codes and regulations do not consider resilience. They do not aim at preventing pollution. They do not aim at preventing the waste of resources when rebuilding a building. And they do not look at effects on people and communities in case of fire. So this is left to us, the ones who design and construct buildings, to be sustainable, which means that we really should try to get better buildings than the minimum requirements in the legislation. So, and last but not least, also Fanny told you about Sustainable Development Goals. Fire resilient buildings contribute to these goals, notably the SDGs number 9, 11 and 12. Cities and communities will be more resilient for fires when we include fire resilience. People and infrastructure will be less affected, less disrupted also, and valuable resources will be preserved and prevented to be wasted. And with that, I want to close my part on the sustainability assessment.
Yes, and now we already reached our conclusions for today. Kat, can you change the... Yes, and here it is. 3 reasons why fire resilience and sustainable buildings go hand in hand. The first one is that in order to assure sustainable cities with sustainable buildings, they must be resilient to all kinds of disruption, including fire. The second thing is that fire safety has now been included in the new version of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, as Agnes mentioned, which is a step towards acknowledging the link between fire resilience and sustainable building. And we don't think that we should stop there, of course. And then last but not least, which is not really a reason, but more something that we wanted to say to everyone who's here today, that it's important to get involved and make sure that your building is fire resilient and thereby more sustainable.
And now we'll have our last poll in the webinar today.